What's on? Watch me.
So this video is the core results. It's looking at sales uplift across platform. This is why we're here. And we'll get straight into it. What we can see from the graph is that the good news is video advertising works. So all platforms render some sort of incremental value in terms of sales uplift, but some do better than others. And at the end of the day, what we can see is that TV delivers more sales uplift than any other platform on any device. And this is good news for the magic of TV. So regardless of device, TV drives more sales lift than any other platform. And you can see that from the index. So again, we explain the STAS index, it starts at 100 and anything from 100 above means there's an impact. And as the index grows, the impact is greater. And that's great, but what happens from an ad level, right? So let's have a look under the surface. So some interesting stuff came out of this ad analysis. What we did find was that higher performing ads perform better on every platform. So what was interesting about that for me is that this is exactly why we have to hold creative constant across all of the different platforms. Because if we had have played some good creative and some bad creative and not equally across platforms, it would have absolutely had an impact on the sales uplift. And that's not fair to the platform that receives the creative that's not so great. So high performing ads perform high on every platform regardless, but it's at relative levels. So the high performing ads on Facebook, for example, still have a lower STAS than the high performing ads on TV. So what we can actually see in this work is there's a double jeopardy effect. So television, for example, gets a higher proportion or a higher number of ads above the baseline, but on top of that, by the greatest amount. So that's a double jeopardy effect. It would work in the reverse. So a lower performing platform gets fewer numbers of incremental sales at a lower level. So what does this mean for memory forming? So STAS is one thing, but what about recall? Lots of advertisers ask about recall, which essentially is a concept of explicit memory. What we can see is that it kind of makes sense. So TV gets close to double the amount of recall than YouTube and Facebook, which is relative to the STAS numbers. So this is good news. And again, recall is a measure of explicit memory, whether you actually recalled it after the view. And it does make sense that the performance of recall is relative to the performance of STAS. So what else we did is we wanted to understand the impact of frequency on different platforms, for example. So we had new groups and we exposed them to 6 brands twice. So the way we did it was investigating the impact of sales uplift of repetitive exposures on the same platform. So again, 6 ads twice in the rotation. Now, what would we expect? Literature says that frequency, essentially the advertising response function is convex. What that means is we expect that the first impression has the greatest impact, and then there's diminishing returns after that. So we wanted to understand if our data was normal and whether this was actually the case. And what we can see is yes. So 2 exposures on the same platform does deliver slightly greater incremental uplift, but on a diminishing return basis. So again, the first impression has the most significant uplift from the baseline, and then there's a small incremental uplift from that. And you can see with the information on the slides that on average it's around about 5 points above the first impression. So what this means for us is also that recall should follow suit. That if recall and STAS are somewhat related, that it should be the case. But what we can see is actually the recall is slightly lower than the sales uplift. What this means is that you can only remember as much as you can remember, and an additional impression only barely helps it, not significantly helps it. But again, you know, looking back to the literature, what we can see in our own data is that it fits with what we would expect, that the first impression is the one that matters the most, and subsequent impressions after that diminish with impact. So that means that the first impression should have, you should invest more upfront than worry about frequency. So what's interesting is even with a second impression, Facebook and YouTube don't hit the stats that TV delivers in the first impression. So again, it's important that the first impression counts the most. So the other thing we did with multi-contacts is we looked at synergy. So synergy is essentially about investigating the synergistic effect between the ad being seen twice, but on different platforms. And how we did this is we had some new groups and we asked people we exposed people to the ads on television, and then subsequently, pretty much straight after, we asked them to jump onto Facebook or jump onto YouTube. And again, we intercepted ad load. So it's the same ads they've seen twice, but across different platforms. And the reason why we do that is because there's often an argument around, particularly from the advocates of Facebook and YouTube, that say a dual buy or a synergistic buy is the most effective. So we wanted to have a bit of a look at that. So what we can see is, yeah, absolutely, there is some evidence of a synergistic effect, because at the end of the day, when you have two views, the STAS is actually slightly greater, but there's no real evidence of synergy to TV. So what that means is, because the poorer performing platforms have a lower STAS, the second view actually does. So the synergistic effect works for YouTube and Facebook. But if you flip it around, there's no extra value for television if you add a second view with YouTube or TV. So one single exposure on TV is enough, which is basically what I'm trying to explain. From a recall perspective, as you would expect, there's an increase in recall in line with 2 times frequency. So as expected, the second exposure does generate slightly more recall, but again, only marginally and no more than TV alone. So what we like to say is that in a TV buy, the only synergy effect is really recall. So you get a little bit more memory forming, but you certainly don't get any more incremental sales. So best to stick to the highest performing platforms for all reach points.
Wow, there are really huge differences in the advertising efficiency of TV, Facebook and YouTube. Can that even be true? How do you explain that, especially towards Facebook and YouTube?
It's sometimes, controversial findings are difficult to digest, but the reality is this is not new news to me. So the very vast gap between the effectiveness of Facebook and YouTube to television is evident across many countries. So can you believe me? Don't I have a believable face? But seriously, it's the generalizability across all different sets of data that leads me to know that these results are real and they're meaningful.
Interesting in terms of advertising effectiveness is the influence of spot creation. In your opinion, what role does it play?
Yeah, I think you might be asking me whether, because we picked the ads, right? So we picked the different categories, we picked the ad length, and I guess at the end of the day, most social platforms don't usually have the same types of ads as television, or vice versa. But again, that's why we kept the ads constant. So spot creation definitely plays a role, but the purpose of this work was to isolate that. So we're talking about a baseline here. So if you add targeting, the baseline will change, the impact will change. If you add better ads, the impact will change. But we wanted to make sure that it was apples for apples across platforms. And so these are the spot creations that were fair to all platforms.
A short question about the creation. The results are based on all tested spots, on average values, but there are also commercials that work better on YouTube or Facebook than on TV. Are there not?
They are not. What we see is that, and that's a good question, but what we see is that actually the ads perform relative. So high performing ads perform better than the low performing ads on all platforms, but it's relative to the impact that the platform produces. So we tried to explain this during the video, but essentially that means that, for example, TV gets not only a greater number of ads above baseline, but they perform slightly better on TV as well. So there is a true double jeopardy effect in there. So it's reverse for the poor performing ads. So they have fewer ads that perform well at a lower level. So this is why it's super important that we hold creative constant, because if we didn't, what would happen? It would be potentially unfair to the platform that we played average creative on. So the good news here is that creative does matter. We can see a really obvious difference between high performing ads and low performing ads, and that's consistent across platforms. But for the sake of this work, again, it was important to keep that constant.
Karen, you are talking about recall and STAS in this context. Seems to be a little bit complicated. What exactly do the two impact indicators depict?
Okay, they are different, and that's an important point. STAS is about familiarity, right? It's not about memory. Okay, so, sorry, let me start again. It's about implicit memory. It's not about explicit memory. So STAS is more around, sometimes you do things you don't even know why you do. So it's about familiarity. So when you go to a shelf, half the time you pick because you're familiar with that brand and you've bought it before. In fact, more than half the time. And so STAS reflects that. And STAS reflects, so we talked about the fact that we measure attention, and we measure whether you're looking at the television or whether you're on the couch and you're not looking at the television. But that still plays a role. So even if you've got medium or low attention or passive attention, whatever you want to call it, that still plays a role. And STAS reflects that, right? Because sometimes you choose things that you don't know why you've chosen it, but it's this priming effect. Whereas recall is you literally having to deep dive into your brain or your cognitive thinking and try to pull something out of it, which, we all know that's difficult when we are super busy, and let's be honest, advertising's not our main priority. So it's a good point. Recall and STAS definitely measure different things. There is a crossover, but one is truly explicit memory, which gets you only so far. It doesn't actually account for all of the value that you get from seeing something passively.
Okay, got it. And here's my last question. It's always about advertising impact, but also about reach as the basis for impact. You say that an additional advertising contact on Facebook and YouTube has no additional effect. But one argument for both platforms is, of course, their reach, especially in young target groups, which is not so easily for linear TV, right?
Yes and no. I don't disagree with you that the goal of a second impression should be more about incremental reach versus bashing someone over the head with frequency. The problem that you have is there are also patterns that sit below that. And what you'll find is that often you're not gaining true, unique reach. You're gaining frequency on duplicated reach. At the end of the day, that's not how we build the experiment. The experiment is controlled. But in the real world, if you can supplement, if your second view is truly unique reach, then there is some value in it, without a doubt. And I stand here and agree with you.
Watch me. Anything could happen. Bigger than we imagine. We're gonna break free.
Screenforce, what's on?
Watch me.